Hi, and welcome back to Essential Beliefs. This is a series of studies in which we're looking at very fundamental teachings of God that are necessary to maintaining life, connection, improvement, growth, development. But they're not just for Christians, or in the case of the Old Testament, they're not just for Jews. And I think sometimes I know I've in the past made mistakes of thinking that God deals in the realm of Jews or Christians, and the rest of the world is just kind of on its own. He doesn't really deal with them because they're separated from him by sin and kind of out of his hands, kind of a prodigal son type thing. And what we've been trying to demonstrate is that God has been involved in all nations throughout all history, continues to do so. Therefore, when he says something, particularly something that deals with mankind, etc. It's a universal reality, and for us to live against that then is to create jeopardy for ourselves, for our relationships, for our state, for our nation, for our church, whatever it might be. One of those fundamental truths that we're going to look at today is about our responsibility to be submissive to the governing authorities. I think this is very appropriate, especially for where we are in our history in the United States, that it's important that we go back and reconsider this, not just to remind us as Christians that we've got to be very mindful about how we respond to those in government positions and those in positions of authority or power, especially authority, because that's the underlying issue with God. We've got to be careful that we're Christ-like in how we do that, but also to realize that for cultures to survive, for nations to survive, there has to be a respect for this reality of submitting to the powers that be, so to speak. Now, there's a lot of ways that this has been challenged throughout our culture, but maybe more so in the last 50 or 60 years of less and less trust of government, less and less submission to government, more of an idea of I have a right to do my own thing, or even overthrow of government. And I think one of the places where that has started coming to, or thought has started coming to fruition is the issues that we see brought out almost weekly of an African American, usually male, being killed by a white police officer. This has created a lot of racial tension, or it has brought to a head a lot of racial tension. And it has created a dialogue that's going on for a while now that is leading more to demonstrations, in some instances riots, to the extent that I think many in leadership now have the idea that if that kind of event takes place, they should expect rioting. And rioting is an aggressive response to the powers that be, etc. So in the news for quite a while has been white police officer on black citizen shootings or killings. The whole issue has become so politicized that it's very difficult to talk about it rationally. It's very difficult to have a dialogue because it creates so much heat, just the idea, and very little light. Now, some kind of disclaimers before we get into this, because there's an intersection here on both sides of submitting to the governing authorities. Have African Americans, and in fact, most any minority in the United States, been treated unfairly? Absolutely. Are all police officers good? Well, absolutely not. Are all bad? Absolutely not. Are all citizens good? Absolutely not. Are all citizens bad? Absolutely not. Are all black citizens good? Absolutely not. Are all black citizens bad? Absolutely not. The whole point of racism is to paint a whole segment of people with a broad brush, that they're the same way. And that happens with any way, any criteria which we segregate human beings. And I don't mean that in terms of racial segregation. What I mean is identification of types of people. Then the tendency then is both ways, to paint with a broad brush rather than to understand the individual, et cetera, et cetera. Now, please understand, for this discussion, where there is no authority, there can be no agreement. In a relativistic culture, there can be no discussion or no agreement about just about anything because there can be no truth. That's the whole point of relativism. That what you perceive as reality is your reality, what I perceive as my reality is my reality, and you can't convince me of your reality because there is no authority behind your reality. It's just your subjective reality. That's relativism. Under that kind of ideology, anyone can call anyone anything without needing to demonstrate it because A, there's no ability to demonstrate it. Again, there's no authority. There's no Hoyle's Book of Rules that you can turn to settle a disagreement like that, an ideological disagreement, if there is no authority. If we are truly a relativistic culture, then there's no way to have a discussion in which one person convinces another. And I think one of the dangers going on in our culture right now, I think we've reached that tipping point that we've given up on the idea that people can be convinced because people's reality is their reality. So now what they need to be done is either marginalized, overcome, canceled, destroyed, or whatever. That's the only way to deal with an ideology in the midst of relativism is yours has to be done away with because there cannot be a meeting of the minds. Therefore, division is the only result, and with division, especially as ideology becomes more vehemently described, division then will lead to conflict, and conflict can lead to war or revolution. Interestingly, if you look around, there's very little call for discussion or agreement or change. There's just discussion about who's aggrieved. There's not a lot of discussion between Black Lives Matter, Police Life Matters, All Life Matters, because there is no way to bring those ideologies into the room and evaluate them based upon an objective standard of do they have standing or not. So in that kind of a situation where there's no room for discussion and there's no hope for agreement, because there's no authoritative yes or no. There's no authoritative thing that says that is or it is not. And in fact, in our culture, when it comes to laws and things like that, we don't even accept, many of us don't even accept that the Supreme Court is the authoritative statement. They are backed by power, but there are many who question their ability to decide right and wrong. And again, it's because they don't have an authoritative platform other than we've given to them what you say goes. But in terms of how they interpret what they do, there is no book on the shelf that we can go to and says, this is the way it is, this is the way it should be. Now, to those of us who are Christians, that's a great segue into, well, can God help in this situation? Is there a solution? Yes, he can and he has, but the issue that comes up is, will we accept that? Because we have, to a certain extent, culturally bought into this idea of relativism and have been buying into it for a long, long time, more than half a century, which leads to the necessary conclusion, you can't demonstrate that what you're saying is right. I can't demonstrate that what I'm saying is right. And if we disagree and you can't demonstrate, that's going to create frustration in you because I don't see it the way you do, and you're getting frustrated because you can't show me how to see it the way you do, and vice versa. So then what you see is so much of the rancor that's going on in our culture right now. To have a discussion leads to being put down, to being made fun of, etc., which is a way of saying, as Gandhi said, don't raise your voice, make your argument stronger. So what do we do with what's going on, which is just a demonstration of one of many challenges that is facing us. But let's take one right out of the news that we have from time to time. We can't even get over one killing of a black African American by a white police officer until yet another one takes place. And immediately there's judgment, immediately before anybody knows the facts, because it takes so long to get the facts and people want response now. So immediately there's rancor, immediately there's riots, immediately there's pundits all over, liberal media, conservative media, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. How? And that just generates more heat. How do we get light? Well, let's step back and look at the context. All right, every year in the United States of America, approximately 100 Americans are killed by on-duty police officers. That's about 3 a day. Are white citizens killed by white police officers? Yes. Are white citizens killed by black police officers? Yes. Are black citizens killed by black police officers? Yes. Are black citizens killed by white officers? Yes. But except for the last one, the first 3, you don't ever hear of. You're not going to hear of a white-on-white police officer on a white suspect killed. You're not going to hear that. If it's going to be reported, it's going to be reported locally, and it's really not all that significant except for cities that keep the murder count going. Most people aren't going to think much about it. It doesn't get the kind of response. Okay. So race is generally only considered in a white on black case where a white police officer shoots and kills a African American. Now, it's disproportionately reported due to the current racial cultural temperature. In other words, of 1,000 people who are killed a year, the ones that make it to national media are a white police officer killing a black African American citizen. So, without getting into the politics, what we acknowledge right there is a reporting bias. A perceptual bias is often created by a reporting bias. In other words, anecdotal evidence can be used to create a case, but anecdotes in and of themselves don't prove anything, okay? But when you bring an agenda to it, and there's very much an agenda, and the agenda is founded in equality, it's founded in justice, it's founded in, there's good reasons to have these dialogues. Because as we acknowledged at the get-go, have minorities been mistreated? Absolutely. Now, what's the cure for that? The cure is dialogue that solves that. But what's happening is, in the situation of a highly charged racial cultural temperature, the way we're dealing with it is just further charging it. It's not coming to what I'm calling light. It's generating a lot of heat. But in a culture that has kind of rejected the idea that we can find light, because light is objective. There is one thing that we can all know. In the absence of that, that's all you can have, is just continually charging the system. And you and I both understand that media presents to us what's newsworthy, what gets viewers, what sells advertising. And media will acknowledge to you it's biased. And that's what the word newsworthy means, is it's worthy of people's attention because they'll watch it or they'll read it. So how do we bring a biblical perspective to this? What essential beliefs apply in this situation? We've talked about some. Do unto others as you would have them do unto you. If we all work that way, things would be radically different. Eye for an eye and tooth for tooth is justice. There should be justice for everyone, regardless of your station, regardless of your skin color, regardless of your religion, et cetera, et cetera. Now, how do we get to a point that we can apply some biblical principles that will help us to do just that? Well, the first thing is to understand that the best approach is prevention. once you get behind the eight ball, it's very difficult. Once you have, you know, an inflamed, impacted tooth, it's very difficult to get to the problem because now the inflammation becomes the problem. And if you go to the dentist can't actually work on the tooth because it's all impacted and inflamed. And they can't really deal with the pain very much until they get that taken away. So they will probably send you home with antibiotics, and you're going to have to deal with this situation for several days, even a week, until the swelling goes down, and then we can deal with the problem. And that's why prevention is so important. It's why good dental health, good hygiene, good physical health, it's why it's so important, because it prevents these situations from not only occurring, but then festering and becoming so much more than what they originally were. Is there a biblical principle that would prevent us from getting into these tense interpersonal situations? Last week we talked about man cannot live by bread alone, but by every word that proceeds from the mouth of God. Again, we can't pick and choose. And now this one gets personal with God, because this has to do with the personhood of God. You see, when he talks about submitting to the governing authorities, this is personal because that's how we, in part, practice our submission to him. It's how we learn our submission to him, and it's how we practice it. It's not just to him, and then I can treat everybody else differently. It is understanding that this is part and parcel of how I view authority is how I view God. How I view my parents, in part, how I view God. How I view the government is how I view God. And in a culture that, for the last 50 years, has incited, don't trust government, it creates these problems, okay? Now, what happens when government becomes the problem? Now, bear with me. Because that forces us into a situation that is untenable. When you have criminals that are police officers, and you have criminals that they are interacting with, it creates a prevention nightmare. And so what we have now is a festering kind of situation. 1 Peter chapter 2, verse 13, submit yourselves for the Lord's sake to every human institution, whether to a king as to the one in authority, as to governors as sent by him for the punishment of evildoers and to praise those who do right. For such is the will of God, that by doing right you may silence the ignorance of foolish men. Act as free men, but do not use your freedom as a covering for evil, but use it as bondslaves of God. Honor all men, love the brotherhood, fear God, honor the king. All right. That first verse, verse 13, submit yourselves for the Lord's sake. Now, one of the things about essential beliefs that we've acknowledged is you get away from these, any church, any family, any culture, any nation, it's going to destroy you. You cannot, man cannot live by bread alone, but by every word, mankind. I think part of what you're seeing in this whole culture in moving away from God is we're moving away from the solution to so many of the issues, including the one that we're talking about today. Hebrews 13:17, obey your leaders and submit to them, for they keep watch over your souls as those who will give an account. There's justice. Let them do this with joy, not with grief, for this would be unprofitable for you. Now, leaders in this case, I think in the context, it's particularly, sorry, that's a different line that I don't want to answer right now. It's talking about specifically leadership in the church, those kinds of things. But I think the principle includes everything, any kind of leadership. And we want to submit to them because they're going to be held accountable by God for how they deal with us. And that's true of anyone in leadership, from elders to anyone else. Now, in Romans chapter 13, verse 1, let every person be in subjection to the governing authorities. For there is no authority except from God, and those which exist are established by God. Therefore, he who resists authority has opposed the ordinance of God. And they who have opposed will receive condemnation upon themselves. For rulers are not a cause of fear for good behavior, but for evil. Do you want to have no fear of authority? Do what is good, and you will have praise from the same, for it is a minister of God to you for good. But if you do what is evil, be afraid, for it does not bear the sword for nothing. For it is a minister of God, an avenger who brings wrath upon the one who practices evil. Wherefore it is necessary to be in subjection, not only because of wrath, but also for conscience sake. For because of this you also pay taxes, for rulers are servants of God, devoting themselves to this very thing. Render to all what is due them, tax to whom tax is due, custom, custom, fear to fear, honor to whom honor. Now, I think in the first part of the last century, there was more of an idea in this culture that we endure hardship, whatever that hardship is, as either discipline from God or trial through which we grow, etc. In the last half of the last century, I believe those ideas, along with God and church and Jesus, have been rejected to where there is no reason to endure anything that's negative. So Paul, talking about government, was saying that anybody who resists authority opposes the ordinance of God. Now, in modern culture, that doesn't matter to a good number of people. To you and me, it should matter very much. Rulers are not a cause of fear for good behavior, but for evil. And that's going to lead us into the challenge that we have now. Who is worse, an offender who is resisting authority, or an authority who is not administering true justice? You see, if you have a police officer who's violating the law, in quote unquote, in his methodology or her methodology of quote unquote upholding the law, you have someone who is violating, they're living against authority, just like the person that they're trying to arrest or whatever it is. So and authority can use negative measures, they can use sinful measures, they can use illegal measures in order to try to do what they perceive as probably a good thing, or hopefully they perceive that. There will be bad apples who just want to hurt people. Those are in every case. But what we're talking about is two offenders in that situation. And if I'm not mistaken, in most everyone, if not all, of the of the shootings that have led to riots and all of those, we have someone who has committed a crime, who has warrants out for their arrest, who in the process of being arrested for crimes or for those charges that are already, there ends up being a scuffle of some kind, and then an officer shoots a citizen. So to the best of my knowledge, in almost every one of those cases, now I think in the case of Botham Jean, that was different. To my knowledge, there was nothing like that associated with him. There was police officer came into his apartment and he ended up being shot. Okay, but in most of the cases, there is someone involved in a crime, formerly involved in crime, who police officers are trying to subdue, bring to, that are resisting, and they are using sometimes means that violate that person's civil rights. So what we have in some of those cases is crime and crime. And what we're doing, or what we're trying to do in a culture, is the choice between those two evils. This sets people against one another. This sets people against one another on two wrong sides. When good is upheld in all, then there is no choosing between wrongs. And you see, this gets back to, what should someone do who has warrants out for their arrest and they're stopped by the police? God says, submit to the authorities. Do not rebel against it. Um, you will be taken into custody. Then you can plead your case in court. Then that's when justice is going to be, and hopefully it's blind. Now, if you believe that the justice system is corrupt, then you're reticent to submit to that because you believe that it's going to be biased against you. If that's the case, that needs to be addressed. That's something that culture-wide we need to discuss. Is there justice? And if the criminal justice system is imbalanced, that needs to be, because that's an injustice as well. You see, that goes against God's eye for an eye and tooth for a tooth. Crime has always been present. Now, how is it dealt with, and how do we respond to it? God says, submit to the governing authority. Now, what that would do, what that allows, is the prevention of the cycle to begin in the first place. First of all, don't do the crimes. If we submit to God, if we live by every word that comes out of the mouth of God, we don't end up criminals. In fact, we end up a long way from criminal behavior because our standard of living, or our standard of morality, is so much greater than that of even the Pharisees, much less those who are criminals. But if a crime has been committed, or there is a warning that's hanging over me, creating a fear of authority, authority may find me at an inopportune time, at night, in a dimly lit street, something like that. If I resist authority, it brings about a reaction from authority, which brings escalation. What did God say? Don't resist it. And I want to stop here, and I want to appeal to the greatest example of this. Jesus, who had incredible power available to him, did not resist the authority of the day, and they killed him. Now, we're not being naive about this. We're not saying pie in the sky. But as the scriptures we looked at, we're doing this to please God. We're doing this to reverence God. And I think in the past, our nation upheld that to a greater degree because we believed in God. So if I'm in the situation that I'm describing, and I'm a criminal, and I resist authority, that's going to escalate, and what it might bring about is a brutal response from authority. Does that justify that? No. Because that also can be an injustice. That can be illegal, or should be illegal, and that's where the situation constantly needs to be evaluated. But if I do not resist, I either go home safe and intact, or I have my day in court. And if I am innocent, then I go home. Justice prevails. The power of setting this in motion is actually mine. No crime, no resistance, no escalation, no day in court. None of that's necessary if I live by the words that come out of the mouth of God. But if we don't, then we start saying whose criminality is more important, whose criminality is greater, whose criminality is worse. And that sets us against each other. And a house divided cannot stand. And our division being promulgated by a lack of dialogue and the inclusion of the festering that goes on and how this is presented is not leading us toward anything. Now, guys, we're all very attuned when we're mistreated. We cry out to be treated fairly. That's what justice is, eye for an eye and tooth for a tooth. We see ourselves, or we see things through our eyes. We have a bias, okay? And that can create that sometimes justice is not blind, and it needs to be dealt with. And it needs to be dealt with when civil people can sit down and address differences that need to be confronted in our criminal justice system. What possible motivation would there be for accepting unfair treatment? This sounds like an encouragement for the victim to just accept injustice. Why would someone want to accept injustice. Because that's the story of Jesus. He's the motive. You see, we cannot be like him unless we live like him. Jesus suffered for doing good. Many suffer while perpetrating evil. Jesus suffered for doing good. It is indefensible from a biblical perspective to seek justice for doing good. Now, the reason I'm saying that is that justice is not going to prevail unless God is the judge. 1 Peter chapter 2, verse 18, servants, be submissive to your masters with all respect. With all respect, whether they are do it or not. Not only to those who are good and gentle, but also to those who are unreasonable. For this finds favor, if for the sake of conscience towards God, a man bears up under sorrows when suffering unjustly. This finds favor in the eyes of God. For what credit is there if, when you sin and are harshly treated, you endure it with patience? But if when you do what is right and suffer for it, you patiently endure it, this finds favor with God. For you have been called for this purpose, since Christ also suffered for you, leaving you an example for you to follow in his steps, who committed no sin, nor was any deceit found in his mouth. And while being reviled, he did not revile in return. While suffering, he uttered no threats, but kept entrusting himself to him who judges righteously. Jesus wasn't concerned about physical judges. And please understand, the judges of Rome, the judges of Israel, his own people, the judges of the Sanhedrin, they all conspired and they killed him. And to be like him finds acceptance from God. It finds pleasure from God. It finds favor from God. Now, how do you sell that to anybody? Christ. How do we come up with, because guys, we're blessed to live in a nation based on Judeo-Christian principles, but what if we're raised in the Soviet Union? Or what if we're raised in China? What if we're raised in North Korea? What if we're raised where there are brutal dictators? The same still applies. You see, in America, we have the right to cry out. We have the right to demonstrate. We have the right to say, I have received an injustice. But what God is saying about that right is, he gives the example of Jesus. How did he deal with his rights? And he was right. It's all he can be. Why is this coming to a head now? Why in the last 10 years especially has this become a major issue, and probably even more to a head in the last 2 years? Because I think the movement of culture, both black and white culture, away from God. The more religious, the more willing to suffer injustice that people become. The more spiritual we are, the more willing we are to suffer injustice, because we understand that we're receiving favor from God in doing that. Martin Luther King was very much a proponent. We need to change the system. We need to change the legal system. We need to change. And he was doing that from the perspective of, we need to do this because it's right, but at the same time, we need to do it the right way in order to please God. Now, I think in modern times, we need to revolt against the system. There's angry demonstration, there's riot. And and the difference is difficult to see. What's the difference between an angry demonstration and a riot? It's difficult to see because what we see is the anger rather than hear the message. And what is spoken is generally in anger. What we don't hear is the message. And the message is, there needs to be dialogue. There needs to be change. But we've moved away from there needs to be dialogue to where there needs to be disruption. There needs to be pushback against the government. And it's coming to, I think it's coming to a greater head because we've lost God. We've lost essential beliefs and essential truths. I want you to understand that every submission, every subjection is subjection to Christ. Why would I submit to a police officer? Why would I submit to a police officer if I have a warrant out for my arrest? Because that's submission to Christ. That's submission to God. I'm not doing it to them for them. I'm not doing it to them because of their race or their badge or anything else. I'm doing it because authority has been given to them from God. Do they abuse that authority? Some do. They did with Jesus. But that doesn't change the situation. It doesn't change my response or my responsibility. Ephesians chapter 1, verse 19. These are in accordance with the working of the strength of his might, which he brought about in Christ when he raised him from the dead and seated him at his right hand in the heavenly places, far above all rule and authority and power and dominion, and every name that is named, not only in this age, but also in the one to come. And he put all things in subjection under his feet, and gave him his head over all things to the church, which is his body, the fullness of him who fills all in all. Not just in the church, all in all. This subjection to God is demonstrated subjection to Jesus. And what Paul just made clear in Ephesians is any subjection to anyone is subjection to Christ, because he's head over all of it. Yes, the church, but all kingdoms and authorities everywhere. I cannot practice subjection without it being toward Christ. I cannot practice violent opposition without it being against Christ. That's not our way. That's not the way of this nation, but it's becoming that. What about Christians? Every subjection is a subjection to Jesus. So how do Christians respond to injustice against Christians? Demonstrations, riots, storm the Capitol? Storm the Capitol? No. How do we respond? The greatest example recently I want to give you is Brant Jean, Botham's brother, who embraced and forgave Officer Amber Geiger, who shot and killed, was found guilty of murder of his brother. And you remember, we all remember, it was compelling drama. It brought tears to the eyes of the judge. She can be seen wiping tears from her eyes because the world has seen so little of that. Do you realize how that was on the news and then how quickly it was swept away? Because that's not a message the world. It was great drama. And folks said, man, how can this person embrace the person that shot and was found guilty of murdering his brother? Very proud to say, because they're both members of the Church of Christ. They're both Christians. They submit to God through Christ Jesus. One of them died in the midst of that submission. The other forgave. And I assume has forgotten or is forgetting in the name of God. But that's been pushed aside. It has not been heralded as, here's the new order. Here's the way things are handled. Because you see, it looks like victimization of the victim. Because our nation doesn't understand all submission to authority is submission to God. Because our nation doesn't understand God or his teachings, every word that proceeds out of his mouth. Our culture, our nation, and maybe even some of us are beginning to forget that we live by every word that proceeds from the mouth of God. Is it fair? It's not the question. It's never been the question. The question of fairness in a fallen world is naive at best. What it is discipleship. We desperately need it. We desperately need it once again in our nation. We desperately need it once again in our person. Discipleship, no matter the cost, no matter the price. Submit to the governing authorities because God instituted every one of them. And it pleases him when you do that, because by doing that, you submit to him. We need submission. We need a submissive attitude. Brothers and sisters, it is marvelous to work among people who have it. And I would challenge you, maintain your hold on it, because your culture is trying to change you away from that, to seek a justice that is no justice at all. God bless you. I love you. Time's up. I hope that these studies in essential truths help us to stir up what we already know is true, but to be reminded of it so we don't forget, so we persevere. I hope they've been beneficial to you, as I hope this one has. Look forward to seeing you again Sunday. It's going to be great when we do. God bless you. Love you. See you soon.